I almost didn't open the envelope. It was cream-colored, heavier than most mail, with my name written carefully on the front. Not printed. Written. The kind of handwriting that makes you pause, even before you know why. At first, I thought it was a mistake. People don't send handwritten letters anymore. Not unless it matters. And nothing in my life felt important enough to arrive like that. I stood by the door for a moment, keys still in my hand, listening to the quiet of the house. Then I sighed and opened it. Inside was a funeral invitation. I read it once. Then again. I didn't recognize the name of the deceased. Not even faintly. I checked the address. It was mine. I checked the spelling of my name. Correct. There was no explanation. No note. Just the details. The date. The time. The place. And a single line at the bottom that made my stomach tighten. Your presence is requested. Not invited. Requested. I sat down slowly, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I had never heard of this person. I was certain of that. I tried to connect the name to a neighbor, a distant relative, someone from long ago. Nothing came. I told myself it was a mistake. A clerical error. Someone else with the same name. But something about the letter felt deliberate. Intentional. I set it on the table and made tea, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. But all evening, my eyes kept drifting back to that envelope. Why would anyone invite a stranger to their funeral? And why did it feel like I wasn't a stranger at all? That night, I barely slept. Memories I couldn't place drifted through my thoughts. Faces without names. A sense of being watched by a past I didn't remember. By morning, curiosity had replaced hesitation. I decided to go. Not because I wanted to. Because I felt like I was supposed to. The funeral was held 3 days later, in a small town I had only passed through once before. The chapel was modest, quiet, almost hidden among trees. I arrived early and sat in the back. People around me whispered softly, greeting one another with familiarity. They knew each other. They didn't know me. That much was clear. I felt out of place. Like I had wandered into someone else's story. Then the service began. They spoke about the deceased with warmth. With affection. Stories of generosity. Of quiet kindness. Of a life lived without needing attention. I listened carefully, waiting for anything that might explain why I was there. Nothing did. At the end of the service, the officiant cleared his throat. There will be a brief reading of the will, he said. As per the deceased's request. The room shifted. People leaned forward. I didn't. I was still wondering how soon I could leave without being rude. Then I heard my name. Clearly. Deliberately. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then I heard it again. My name. Read aloud. In a room full of strangers. And suddenly, every pair of eyes turned toward me. That was the moment my life quietly stepped into a story I never knew existed. For a few seconds, no one moved. Not the people in the front rows. Not the officiant holding the paper. Not me. It felt as if the room had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out. I heard someone whisper, "Who is she?" Another voice murmured something I couldn't catch. I stayed seated. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't stand. I was afraid that if I moved, whatever thin thread was holding the moment together would snap. The officiant looked in my direction again, searching. "Would you please come forward?" he asked gently. Every instinct in me said no. But my legs moved anyway. I walked down the aisle slowly, aware of every step, every glance that followed me. I could feel curiosity, confusion, and something sharper, discomfort. I reached the front and stood beside the lectern. Up close, The officiant looked as uneasy as I felt. "I apologize," he said quietly, not into the microphone. This was very specific in the instructions. He cleared his throat and continued reading. "To the person named," he said, "I leave my personal effects, my letters, and the house on Willow Street." A low murmur rippled through the room. The house. People turned in their seats. I caught fragments of their reactions. "That's the family house. She's not related. I've never seen her before." My ears rang. I wanted to interrupt, to say there had been a mistake. But the officiant kept reading. "There are no other beneficiaries," he said finally. "This concludes the reading." The silence afterward felt heavier than the one before. I stood there, unsure what to do next. Someone coughed. A woman in the front row shook her head slowly. The officiant folded the paper and looked at me. "You may want to speak with the attorney," he said, nodding toward a man standing near the side door. I nodded, though I didn't trust my voice. As people began to stand and talk among themselves, I stepped aside. The attorney approached me with a polite, professional expression. "You must be very surprised," he said. "That's one way to put it," I replied. He gave a small, understanding smile. "The deceased left clear instructions," he said. "He wanted you present. He wanted you to hear it yourself." "Why?" I asked. The attorney hesitated. "He said you'd understand once you read the letters." Letters. Plural. That word stayed with me as the room slowly emptied. A few people stared openly at me as they passed. Others avoided my eyes. No one spoke to me directly. By the time the chapel was nearly empty, I felt like the only person left standing in a story that belonged to someone else. The attorney handed me a card. "My office is just down the road," he said. "When you're ready." Ready for what? I wondered. Answers. Truths. A past I didn't recognize. Outside, the air felt colder than it had before. I sat in my car for a long time without starting the engine. I tried to remember the name on the invitation. I said it aloud once. Still nothing. No memory. No connection. And yet, that stranger had planned his final act around me. I drove to the attorney's office because there was nowhere else to go. Not physically. And not inside myself. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. It was quiet in a way that made every sound feel louder than it should have been: the scrape of a chair, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the soft rustle of documents being moved from one pile to another. He invited me to sit. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Grateful? Suspicious? Afraid? Instead, I felt empty. Like someone had opened a door inside me and I hadn't yet decided whether to look through it. The attorney placed a small box on the desk between us. "This was left specifically for you," he said. It was sealed. "No one else has read it." The box was wooden, worn smooth at the edges, as if it had been handled often. Inside, he explained, were letters, photographs, a few personal items. He slid the box toward me and stood up. "I'll give you privacy," he said. "Take your time." When the door closed behind him, the room felt suddenly too quiet. I stared at the box for a long moment before opening it. The lid creaked softly. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, all addressed to me. My name. Written again and again in the same careful handwriting from the invitation. My throat tightened. The top envelope was marked "Read this first." I hesitated. Then I opened it. The letter inside was short. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you finally came." I stopped breathing. "I have wondered for years if you would come when the time arrived. I hoped you would. Not for me, but for yourself." My hands began to shake. I hadn't known this man. But he knew me. "You do not remember me," And that is not your fault. I made choices that kept me at a distance. Choices I believed were necessary at the time. Necessary. That word again. It seemed to follow stories like this. I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I am writing to tell you the truth before it disappears with me. I read the line twice. The truth before it disappears. My heart pounded. I turned the page. I was part of your life once. Briefly. Quietly. In a way you were never meant to notice. I closed my eyes. A strange sensation washed over me, not recognition, but something close to it. Like standing in a room you've never been in before, yet somehow knowing where the window should be. I kept reading. You were a child when I last saw you. Too young to understand why some people stay invisible even when they care deeply. Invisible. I thought of the faces at the funeral. People who knew him. People who had no idea who I was. The house on Willow Street was never just a house. It was where I kept what I couldn't keep in my life. Letters. Memories. Proof that some things existed, even if they were never acknowledged. My chest felt tight now. This wasn't about inheritance. This was about memory. I trusted that one day, when you were ready, you would find your way here. I lowered the letter slowly. My reflection stared back at me from the glass of the desk. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked different. Because she felt like someone standing at the edge of a story that had been waiting far longer than she had known. I reached into the box again. There were photographs. Old ones. Black and white. One of them showed a small child standing in a garden. My breath caught. It was me. I knew it instantly. Same crooked smile. Same way of standing slightly turned, as if unsure whether to face the camera fully. I had no memory of the moment. But the evidence was undeniable. I was there. And so was he. Just outside the frame. I could see the edge of his coat sleeve. Proof without explanation. I sat back in the chair, the weight of it all pressing down on me. The funeral hadn't been an ending. It had been an introduction. And whatever this man had been to me, whatever I had been to him, was about to change how I understood my own past. I gathered the letters back into the box carefully. I wasn't ready to read the rest. Not yet. Some truths need to be approached slowly. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The name on the will hadn't been a mistake. And the stranger in that coffin hadn't been a stranger at all. I didn't go to the house right away. The attorney offered to drive me there that afternoon, but I declined. I told him I needed time. That was only partly true. What I really needed was distance, just enough to breathe without the walls of a stranger's life closing in on me. I drove home instead. The road back felt longer than it had that morning. Traffic lights blurred. Familiar streets looked slightly off, as if they belonged to a different version of my life. I kept thinking about the photograph. About the sleeve at the edge of the frame. About how close he had been without ever stepping fully into view. That night, I spread the letters across my kitchen table but didn't open them. I made soup. I washed dishes. I folded laundry. I did all the ordinary things people do when they are trying to convince themselves that something extraordinary isn't happening. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was shallow and broken, full of half-formed images, a garden I didn't remember, a voice I couldn't place, a feeling of being watched over from a distance. In the morning, I decided to go. Willow Street was quieter than I expected. The houses were old but well kept, the kind of street where trees arch over the road and leaves collect in the gutters. The house itself sat a little back from the sidewalk, painted a faded blue. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a long time. This was where he had lived. Where he had kept what he couldn't keep anywhere else. I finally stepped out and walked up the path. The key the attorney had given me felt heavy in my hand. The door opened easily. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and something woody, like old books. The rooms were modest, clean, quiet. Nothing about the place felt grand or dramatic. It felt careful. I walked slowly, touching nothing at first. A small table by the door held a bowl for keys. A coat hung on a hook, still there, as if he might come back for it. In the living room, there were shelves of books. Many of them marked with notes tucked between pages. A chair by the window looked worn in the way that suggests long hours spent sitting, thinking. On the wall hung photographs. Not many, but enough. Some were landscapes. Others were of people I didn't know. And then I saw it. A photograph of me. Older this time. Maybe in my 20s. Taken from across a street, judging by the angle. I was laughing with someone, unaware of the camera. My breath caught. He had watched my life from a distance. Not intrusively. Carefully. I felt a strange mix of emotions rise in me: unease, curiosity, something close to grief. I sat down on the edge of the chair and let it wash over me. This wasn't obsession. It felt like restraint. A man who wanted to be present and chose not to be. I stood and moved toward a small desk in the corner. On it lay a single envelope. Addressed to me. In the same careful handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I walked through the rest of the house first. The bedroom was simple. The kitchen tidy. Everything suggested a life lived quietly, without drawing attention. In the last room, I found what he had meant. Boxes. Labeled by year. Inside were letters never sent, addressed to me at different ages. Notes about moments in my life I had forgotten. Things that had mattered to me once. I understood then. This wasn't inheritance. This was responsibility. He hadn't left me things. He had left me a story. One he never allowed himself to tell while he was alive. I went back to the desk and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sentence. I stayed away because I believed loving you meant not being known. I sat there for a long time, holding that truth. Because suddenly, the stranger's funeral felt less like an ending. And more like the beginning of a conversation that had been waiting my entire life. I didn't read the letters in order. At first, I opened the ones marked with years I remembered clearly. Years where I could place myself. Years where I knew who I had been. The handwriting never changed. Always steady. Always careful. Never rushed. The first letter I read was dated when I was 16. You cut your hair today. Shorter than you've ever worn it. I almost didn't recognize you from across the street, and then you laughed, and I knew. I stopped. I remembered that haircut. I had cried in the salon bathroom afterward, afraid I had made myself unrecognizable even to myself. I kept reading. You looked lighter afterward. Like you had stepped out of something that no longer fit. My throat tightened. He had seen me on a day I barely remembered, and yet he remembered it clearly. Another letter, a few years later. You argued with your mother in the grocery store parking lot. I could hear the sharpness in your voice even from where I stood. You drove away angry, and I stayed where I was, hoping you would calm down before you reached home. I closed my eyes. That argument had stayed with me for years. I had always wondered why my mother forgave me so easily afterward. Why she didn't bring it up again. Had he said something to her? Or had he simply watched, trusting that love inside my life was already doing its work? The letters were never intrusive. They didn't describe my private moments. They described the edges. The in-between spaces. The places where care could exist without interference. One letter, written when I was 22, made my hands tremble. You stood outside the hospital today, pacing. Someone you love was inside. You didn't cry, but your shoulders told the truth. I wanted to cross the street. I wanted to put a hand on your back and say you weren't alone. My breath caught. That day came rushing back to me. The hospital. The waiting room. The fear I hadn't known how to name. I had been alone that day. Or so I thought. I set the letter down and pressed my palms flat against the table. This wasn't surveillance. It wasn't control. It was restraint carried for decades. A man choosing absence every day because he believed presence would harm more than help. I didn't know yet whether that belief was right. But I could feel the weight of it. The later letters grew shorter. Not because he cared less. Because he was tired. You seem happy now. I'm glad for that. That was all one letter said. Another, written only a year before his death. If you ever find these words, I hope you don't feel watched. I hope you feel held, in the quiet way I tried to hold you. Held. That word stayed with me. I sat there until the light outside shifted and the house grew dimmer. This man had lived his entire life in the margins of mine. Not because he didn't love me, because he loved me in a way that never asked to be seen. I didn't know yet who he was to me. Not truly. But I knew this much. The stranger in the coffin hadn't been trying to claim me. He had been protecting something. My life. My peace. And now that protection had ended. And the story had been placed, gently but firmly, in my hands. After hours inside the house, I realized there was one thing I had been carefully avoiding. Not the letters. Not the photographs. Not even the truth that had already begun to take shape. I was avoiding the question of who he was to me. The letters spoke around it. The photographs hinted at it. The will placed me at the center of it. But nowhere, not yet, did he name himself. I finally found the answer in a small drawer beneath the desk. It was locked. The key was taped to the underside of the drawer, hidden but not truly concealed. As if he had wanted it to be found, but not casually. Inside were documents. Old ones. A birth certificate. My birth certificate. I had seen it before, years ago, but I had never studied it closely. Back then, it was just a formality. A piece of paper that existed somewhere in a drawer. Now it felt different. My mother's name was there. Familiar. And beneath it, in smaller print, a line I had never noticed before. Father, not listed. My chest tightened. Beneath the certificate lay a second document. A court filing. An agreement. I read slowly, carefully, afraid of misunderstanding a single word. He had signed away his parental rights. Voluntarily. Not because he was forced. Because he chose to. The date stopped me cold. It was shortly after I was born. Before I could have formed a single memory. Before my life had even begun to take shape. I sat down heavily. This wasn't abandonment. It was sacrifice. At least, that was how he had understood it. A note was clipped to the file. I believed loving you meant stepping back. I believed stability mattered more than presence. I pressed the paper flat, my hands trembling. I thought of my childhood. Of how safe it had felt. Of how ordinary. Of how loved I had been. Nothing about my upbringing had been broken. Nothing had been lacking. And yet, here was proof that someone else had loved me too, from a distance I never saw. I didn't know what to feel. Gratitude felt complicated. Anger felt misplaced. Sadness felt inevitable. I thought of my mother. Had she known? I searched the box again and found another letter, this one addressed not to me, but to her. Unsent. I am grateful every day that you gave her the life I could not. I stayed away not because I didn't care, but because I trusted you. Trusted her. trusted that love would reach me without him needing to step inside it. I realized then that my life had been shaped by decisions made quietly, without my consent, but not without care. That knowledge did not make everything right, but it made it human. I sat in the fading light, surrounded by pieces of a life I never knew was brushing up against mine. And I understood something else too. The reason my name was in the will. The reason I had been invited to the funeral. He didn't want recognition. He wanted acknowledgement. Not from the world. From me. I stayed in the house until nightfall, turning lamps on as the darkness settled. I wasn't ready to leave yet. Because once I did, I would have to decide what to do with the truth. And for the first time since hearing my name spoken aloud in that quiet chapel, I understood this story wasn't asking me to inherit a house. It was asking me to decide how much of the past I was willing to carry forward. I stayed in the house that night. Not because I planned to. Because I couldn't bring myself to leave. The attorney had said I could take my time. That the house was mine now, in whatever way I chose to understand that word. Ownership felt strange. Heavy. Like a coat I wasn't sure fit yet. I slept on the couch in the living room. The cushions smelled faintly of old fabric and something familiar I couldn't name. I didn't turn off the lamp. The quiet felt different here. Not empty. Observant. At some point in the night, I woke up. Not suddenly. Not afraid. Just awake. The clock on the wall said 2:17 a.m. I sat up slowly, listening. There was no sound except the house settling into itself. Pipes cooling. Wood adjusting. The ordinary noises of a place that had held one person's life for a long time. I don't know why I spoke out loud. I hadn't planned to. But the words came anyway. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. The room didn't answer. Of course it didn't. Still, it felt important to ask. I think I would have understood, I continued. Maybe not when I was young. But eventually. I waited, as if silence might shape itself into a response. Instead, I felt something loosen in my chest. I realized then that I wasn't angry at him. Not truly. I was grieving a relationship that had never existed in the open. Grieving conversations we never had. Moments that never happened. A voice I would never hear say my name. And yet, he had known me. In ways that felt unsettling and tender at the same time. I got up and walked through the house again, this time without urgency. I noticed small details I had missed earlier. A mug with a crack along the rim. A stack of library books by the door. A calendar with dates circled but no explanations written beside them. I wondered if some of those dates were mine. Birthdays. Graduations. Moments he allowed himself to notice. In the kitchen, I sat at the small table and rested my forehead against my hands. "I don't know what to do with you," I said quietly. "With this." There was no instruction manual for this kind of truth. No guide for how to place a person into your life after they were already gone. I thought about my mother again. About how she had never spoken of him. Not once. I had always assumed my story was simple. Now I knew it had been carefully protected. I went back to the box of letters and picked one at random. This one wasn't dated. "I hope you never feel divided," it read. "I hope knowing me doesn't take anything away from the life you already have." That line broke something open in me. Because it named the fear I hadn't admitted yet. That learning about him would fracture what I loved. That honoring him might mean betraying the people who raised me. But the more I sat with the truth, the clearer something became. This wasn't an either-or story. It was an addition. A layer. A quiet presence that had always existed without asking to be acknowledged. As dawn approached, light crept slowly into the room. I felt exhausted, but steadier. I understood then that the funeral had not been an interruption. It had been an invitation, not to mourn a stranger, but to meet a part of my own history. And that meeting didn't require anger. It required honesty. With myself. With the past. With the life that would continue after this night ended. I lay back down as morning arrived. And for the first time since this story began, I slept. I didn't tell my mother right away. Not because I was hiding anything. Because I didn't yet know how to carry the truth without dropping it. Some truths are heavy not because they are shocking, but because they rearrange the past. And the past, once rearranged, never looks the same again. I drove back from Willow Street late in the morning. The house disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the weight of it stayed with me. The letters sat on the passenger seat beside me, tied neatly with a ribbon he must have added himself. When I pulled into my driveway, everything looked the same. The same front door. The same window where my mother used to watch for me when I was late coming home. The same quiet street where my childhood had unfolded without interruption. That normality almost undid me. Inside, my mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed vegetables at the sink. "Hi," she said, turning around. "You look tired." "I am," I replied. She smiled and reached for a towel. "Sit. I'll make tea." I sat at the table where I had done homework, where arguments had happened, where forgiveness always came faster than punishment. For a few minutes, we spoke about nothing. Traffic. Weather. Someone she knew from church. I let her talk. Then I took a breath. "I went to a funeral," I said. She paused. "A funeral?" she asked. "For who?" I said the name. She froze. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But enough. The towel slipped slightly in her hands. "I didn't know him," I continued carefully. "Not really. But my name was in the will." The room went very quiet. She didn't sit down. She didn't speak. She just leaned against the counter, as if her body had suddenly remembered something it had been holding back for years. "I was going to tell you one day," she said finally. That sentence told me everything. I nodded. "I know," I replied. I think he believed that too. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I was young," she said. "And afraid." I didn't interrupt. "He loved you," she continued. "In the only way he thought he could." Tears slid down her face then. Not dramatic ones. Old ones. The kind that had been waiting. "I wanted you to have a simple life," she said. "One where you never had to question whether you were wanted." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I did," I said. "I really did." She squeezed my fingers tightly. For a long time, we sat there without speaking. Two women holding different pieces of the same story. Neither wrong. Neither complete on her own. I realized then that my mother had not erased him from my life. She had carried the weight of that choice alone. And now, finally, she could set it down. That afternoon, we opened one of the letters together. Not all of them. Just one. It felt right to let her hear his voice too. When we finished reading, she wiped her eyes and smiled faintly. "He always wrote like that," she said. As if he were standing just outside the room. I smiled back. "He was," I said. And for the first time since this story began, the truth felt shared. Not heavy. Not lonely. Shared. After that day, something softened between my mother and me. Not because things had been broken before, but because a quiet weight had finally been lifted. She no longer avoided certain memories. She no longer redirected conversations that drifted too close to the past. It was as if the truth, once spoken, had given her permission to rest. We talked about him sometimes. Not often. Not with drama. Just small things. What he liked to read. How he laughed when he was nervous. How he believed deeply in staying out of the way if it meant protecting someone else's peace. "I never stopped thinking about him," she said once. "I just learned how to live without saying his name." That felt honest. And honesty was enough now. I went back to the house on Willow Street a few more times. Not to search. Just to sit. To let the place become familiar in a quiet way. I cleaned out the kitchen cabinets. Watered the plants he had left behind. Opened windows and let air move through rooms that had been closed for too long. The house didn't feel haunted. It felt patient. As if it had been waiting to be seen for what it was. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, I found a notebook. Inside were lists. Books he wanted to read. Places he wanted to see. Things he never got around to. At the bottom of one page, written smaller than the rest, was a single line. "I hope she knows I never left because I didn't care." That line stayed with me. Because it explained something important. Love doesn't always look like staying. Sometimes it looks like stepping back and trusting others to step forward. I didn't have to agree with his choice to understand it. I didn't have to approve it to accept it. The more I sat with the truth, the more I realized it hadn't come to disrupt my life. It had come to fill in a blank space. One I hadn't known was empty. Friends asked questions when they found out. Some were curious. Some uncomfortable. "How do you feel about it?" they asked. I thought about that carefully. "I feel informed," I said. Not replaced. Not shaken. Just informed. Because that was the truth. Nothing I loved had been taken from me. My childhood remained intact. My relationship with my mother remained strong. My sense of self remained whole. The truth hadn't undone anything. It had explained something. And explanation, I learned, can be a quiet form of peace. I stopped thinking of the funeral as something strange. I began to think of it as intentional. A final act of care from someone who had lived his entire life believing distance was love. He had waited until he could no longer complicate my life with his presence. Then he left me the truth. Gently. Carefully. Without demands. That restraint shaped how I held his memory. Not with resentment. With understanding. I realized then that some people shape your life not by being visible in it, but by choosing when not to be. And sometimes, the most important thing they leave behind is not property or possessions, but context. A fuller picture of who you are, and why your life unfolded the way it did. Life didn't pause for me to catch up. It rarely does. Bills still arrived. Work still needed attention. People still expected me to show up as the same person I had always been. And in most ways, I was. But something inside me had shifted quietly. I noticed it in small moments. When I passed a father holding his child's hand and felt a softness instead of a question. When I heard someone talk about absence and didn't immediately assume neglect. When silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling intentional. I didn't tell many people about what had happened. Not because I was ashamed. Because the story felt too delicate to hand over carelessly. Some truths need gentle listeners. I visited the house on Willow Street less often. Not because it mattered less. Because it had done what it needed to do. It had given me access to a part of my past that no longer needed to remain hidden. One afternoon, as I stood in the living room preparing to lock up for a while, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small framed note on the shelf. I must have walked past it dozens of times. It read, "Some love does not ask to be known. It asks to be trusted." I stood there holding my keys, letting that sentence settle. He had trusted my life to unfold without him stepping into it. That trust had shaped everything. I realized then that I didn't need to decide what he was to me. Not in a neat way. He wasn't a father in the way the word is usually used. He wasn't a stranger either. He was a truth, a presence that had existed quietly alongside my life. And that was enough. My mother and I grew closer in ways I hadn't expected. Not because we talked about him often, but because the weight of secrecy was gone. We laughed more easily. We argued less. There was nothing left to protect each other from. That freedom mattered. One evening, she said something that stayed with me. "I was always afraid you'd feel like something was missing," she said. I shook my head. "Nothing was missing," I replied. "Something was just unnamed." She smiled then. A real smile. As time passed, the shock faded completely. What remained was perspective. I understood my life better. Not differently. Better. I no longer wondered why certain parts of my past felt especially stable. Why my childhood had felt protected. Why love in my life had always arrived quietly, without spectacle. It had been modeled that way. I thought back to the funeral chapel, to the moment my name had been spoken aloud. At the time, it had felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Now, it felt like the ground had simply shifted into place. I hadn't been called forward to inherit something. I had been called forward to understand something. And understanding, I was learning, is one of the most lasting forms of closure. The stranger in the coffin was no longer a stranger. But he also wasn't someone I needed to grieve loudly. He had lived his life the way he believed was right. I would live mine with the benefit of knowing that. That felt like the balance he had hoped for. And as days continued, quietly and steadily, I carried the story with me. Not as a burden, but as context. As a fuller understanding of where I came from. And sometimes, that is the greatest inheritance of all. There came a moment, weeks later, when I realized I was no longer waiting for another revelation. No final letter. No hidden document. No last surprise. The story had finished telling itself. What remained was choice. I stood in the house on Willow Street one last time before deciding what to do with it. The rooms felt familiar now. Not because they were mine, but because I understood why they had existed. This house had been a container. For restraint. For memory. For a kind of love that never demanded proof. I didn't rush the decision. I walked through each room slowly. I opened the windows. I let light fall where it hadn't been invited before. In the bedroom, I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside a book. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a sentence. If you are reading this and feeling steady, then I did my job. I smiled softly. Steady. That was exactly how I felt. Not emotional. Not overwhelmed. Steady. I decided to keep the house for a while. Not forever. Just long enough to honor what it had held. I didn't turn it into a shrine. I didn't preserve it exactly as it was. I lived in it lightly. I cooked simple meals there. I read in the chair by the window. I invited my mother once and let her walk through the rooms quietly. She didn't cry. She just nodded. "He would have liked knowing you were here," she said. That was enough. I didn't tell her everything I found. Some things were mine to carry alone. Over time, the house became less symbolic and more ordinary. And that felt right. Symbols are heavy. Ordinary life is where meaning settles. I eventually sold the house. Not out of rejection. Out of completion. Before handing over the keys, I stood in the empty living room and said one last thing out loud. Thank you. Not for the absence. Not for the choices I hadn't agreed with. But for the care. For the restraint. For leaving the truth in a way that didn't break my life open, but widened it. After that, the story stopped following me everywhere. It stayed where it belonged. In memory. in understanding. In a quiet corner of who I am, people sometimes say they want answers about where they come from. What they often mean is they want reassurance that their life makes sense. Mine always did. I just understand it better now. I was invited to a stranger's funeral. I saw my name in the will. And what I inherited wasn't a house or letters or proof. It was context. It was clarity. It was the freedom to stop wondering. And that is how this story truly ends. Not with shock. Not with loss. But with a life that moved forward, carrying the past gently, without letting it weigh me down.